I'm Miriam.
Derek.
Debbie.
Eric.
Sherry.
American Sign Language is the official language for the deaf community in the United States. Many years ago in 1817, the deaf culture and sign language were thriving. There were many well-educated deaf teachers and doctors and board members all across the world. That was until 1880 when world delegates gathered in Italy to take a vote to forbid sign language worldwide. This was in large part to Alexander Graham Bell's influence on the delegates with his opinion of audism. Parents are encouraged to teach oral language and lip reading because teaching sign language could cause a delay in speech or for their child to be isolated due to professionals today. The Alexander Graham Bell Association is still very influential in today's culture. They still push their beliefs and their opinions on both the deaf community and the hearing professionals daily. I believe that Congress should require parents to teach their children sign language in the first 5 years of their life when their speech is so critical to development. According to Ben Bahan, Robert Hoffmeyer, and Harlan Lane, who wrote A Journey into the Deaf World, having a fully accessible language in the first 5 years of life is so crucial that your brain can actually start to become brain dead if you haven't developed a full language at that point. You may be wondering, why ASL? Why not English? Wouldn't it be easier to teach English in an English-dominant culture? Well, the answer is no. Sign language is a full, complete language, and deaf is a full, complete culture. Deaf people don't learn the same way that hearing people learn because they can't hear. English is an audible language. So while they may be able to learn some words or phrases, they'll never fully understand the full English language. Sign language is a visual language. It has its own grammar, its own hand shapes, its own mouth movements. It has its own facial expressions, word order, and sentence structure. It also has the 5 parameters of sign language, and it's recognized worldwide as a full, complete language. Deaf people can do anything that hearing people can do besides hear, but a solid foundation of sign language as a first language is very important for this overall success of a deaf person. Niles DeMarco is a professional model and dancer who is also profoundly deaf. He also started a foundation in hopes to give every child around the world a first language of sign language. He also recalls in a TED Talk that he really enjoys traveling and that when he travels, he really likes to stop at the deaf schools. But one thing that he was realizing was when he would stop at these schools, the people he would talk to were either not as educated as he was, or they weren't communicating in a full language as he had been taught growing up deaf. Niles was born into a deaf family and because he learned sign language as a first solid language, he was afforded an amazing education and experiences all over the world. He also pointed out a good statistic that 95% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. For 90% of those parents, their children will be the first deaf person that they will ever meet. It's no surprise that many of these hearing parents don't know the importance of American Sign Language as a first language when they've never been introduced to deaf culture or any deaf community or people. For them, the hearing professionals tell them to teach an oral language or lip reading, and they think that they're doing what's best for their child in a hearing world. This was the case for Glenna Cooper. Glenna Cooper is a professor at Tulsa Community College who is also profoundly deaf. Her parents found out that she was deaf at 18 months old, and professionals told her parents that if she was to learn sign language, she would end up very isolated. So she learned English as her first language. She admits that growing up, it was a large struggle to communicate in English, and that many times she struggled throughout her life. For many deaf people, they only acquire a 3rd grade reading level. Now, this statistic is a little skewed because this is more for a deaf person who was not given American Sign Language as a first language. For those adults that were, their reading levels are often much higher. They're very, very proficient in reading. They're bilingual in English and ASL, and many times they're going on to get their PhD and further their education. Having a solid first language, having ASL as a solid first language is really important, but not just in the classroom. Many of these children are being forced into learning an oral language, and they're getting frustrated, and they're feeling alone, and they're beginning to act out. According to a recent study at Oxford University, of the 70 million people in the world that are deaf, 75% of their parents do not use sign language to communicate with them. Being a deaf person in a hearing family and in a mainstream school has got to be heartbreaking. In the documentary, A Deaf Son, a father follows his son through the first 5 years of his life while him and his wife try to teach him English.
If you're ever going to be
Try to teach him English. The father begins to realize that he may have made a mistake when the son named Tommy begins to act out and isn't making the progress that he should with his English, and he begins to scream whenever he can't communicate. The mother, however, was very against sign language. She despised the idea of signing, and she was really set on the idea that her doctors first gave her that her son was disabled and not the fact that he was actually deaf and just needed his own language. Around the time that Tommy turned 5 was the time that they let him begin to start signing. And though the mother was not happy, Tommy began to bloom. He began to communicate well and was just more happy, as he should have been all along. Furthermore, many of these children are facing drug and alcohol issues, and their suicide rates are rising. Many of them go to get help for issues, and they're turned down strictly because they're deaf and they're unable to get the help that they need. Until the hearing world begins to recognize that deaf people have their own language and their own culture, they'll continue to struggle in life and in the classroom. I believe the first place to make the biggest impact of change is by requiring these parents to teach sign language as a first language. I think it will lead the way for these children to learn English down the road and communicate with their peers, other adults, and even their parents if they choose to learn sign language as well. This will change the world as we know it, and it'll help children and so many kids who get left behind in a world that just doesn't understand them.